Right. Okay, so welcome to this webinar, everybody. Let me introduce Diane Salters, our very own Di Salters, who lives in Cape Town, South Africa, is a teaching and supervising transactional analyst. She has 40 years at least in the psychotherapy field. She is the past president of the ITAA, International TA Association. She also holds an MSc in TA psychotherapy from Middlesex and has also completed integrative psychotherapy with the Metanoia Institute. And her hobbies are gardening and pottery. And from what I've seen on Facebook, she's damn good at it. So there we go. Let me hand over to Di without further ado.
Thank you so much, Marguerite, and greetings, everyone. It's lovely to be with you today. And there's nothing I want to add to what's gone on so far, except that possibly, I think it's unlikely we will have breakout rooms being such a small group. I think it will be quite an intimate space anyway in which to be able to share freely, with the proviso that you only share what you feel comfortable sharing, what you feel safe sharing, and if there's something that's recorded you want to remove later, you have that option, as Marguerite has said. So without taking up any more time on that, the topic for today is alienation, which has long been an interest to me and used to be quite commonly talked about within TA in the old days, and less so in the intervening time, and more recently has had something of a revival in some of the TA articles appearing in the TAJ. But its early origins are in the radical psychiatry movement in the San Francisco Bay Area. And that was a time of very turbulent time in the US history, with the anti-Vietnam War marches, the women's movement, the free love and psychedelics. It was a time most of you are probably too young to remember, as well as I do, of when we really thought we'd put the colonialism and the patriarchy and sexism and racism to bed, sort of forever. Ha ha. And of course, in the recent US elections, this again was all terribly relevant stuff. So this seems like a very good moment at which to be talking about this topic and looking at it both in its socio-political and professional and personal uses within TA. So we're used to thinking, I think most of us, of TA as a fairly radical psychotherapeutic philosophy and treatment process, because Burns started off as somebody really turning the tables on psychiatry and psychoanalysis of his time. At the same time, he was politically quite conservative or cautious. And the San Francisco Bay Area group, the radical psychiatry group, took this to a whole new level. And amongst them were Hogie Wycoff, who gets a special mention on my blurb, because she's one of the few women well, also Joy Marcus, but one of the few women who wrote quite a lot out at the time. And although Claude Steiner's name appears on much of what came out of that group, he is always very clear in attributing to Hogie the very large influence that she had on the group and on his thinking. Other names of the time are Joy Marcus, Peter Lariviera, Danielle Goldstein, Robert Schwebel, all members of the Radical Psychiatry Center, not all of whom were TA practitioners. It was a wider group than that. But I want to show you, just because I can, This is one of their journals. I don't know if you can see that clearly. Autographed for me by Claude Steiner. And in it is the article I'm going to refer to a lot by Claude Steiner, and another article by Hogie Wycoff, who was a very radical person, very active in the women's movement, talking about loving cooperative relationships, which is kind of the opposite of what we're going to be talking about today. So that's a little putting it in its context within the TA world. But before we go any further, I'd like to just find out from you what your own thoughts or ideas are about when you come across the concept alienation. What do you understand it to mean, just in terms of everyday use or what you know of it so far?
I'm happy to think aloud, Di. For me, the sense of is the opposite of unity or unit of consciousness, and almost I think sometimes it's feels like a defense against what's different. So if I emphasize the difference between me and the other and try and prove that I'm right, that makes me feel safe. So I push away rather than ambiguity. Those are my initial.
Thank you. So you alienate yourself from the other, as it were, in that, or from the unity. Yeah?
Yeah.
Those are helpful thoughts. Any other ideas that people want to put forward? Marguerite.
Yeah, so in line with that, the word othering comes to mind, othering when I think of alienation, and also not belonging.
Thank you. Yeah. These are all relevant to where we're going today. Thank you. Any other ideas, Stefania?
Hello, everyone. I was just going to jump on what Marguerite was saying in the context of belonging. The only time I've encountered or felt probably alienation was in the context of migrating and moving along a lot around the world and losing one's culture or feeling like not belonging somewhere. Yeah, that's the only time I can think of.
Okay, that's certainly part of the whole concept, and gives us a good starting point.
So I share what came up. So a couple of things, from both a cultural perspective and what I've been exposed to from the myth and some personal experience. So from the myth, I think it's like the very popular the Indian mythological book, which is the Ramayana, which also has alienation there, which is in the form of exile, where Rama is asked to leave from the kingdom and go into the what we call as the Vanvas, the exile in the forest for the 14-year period. From a very cultural perspective, in any time there is there's a violation of an expectation which is laid down by standards of belonging, like for example, not marrying in the caste. So people are so anyone who violates that would be banned from the society, like literally sent away to so it's a form of a punishment of cultural violations or familial violations. That's another thing that came to my mind. From a personal experience, for me, alienation is also about every time there is a disconnect from either a psychological disconnect or even a physiological disconnect. But when there is a disconnect, there is a sense of feeling alone, like in my own fortress. So not feeling like I belong in a world. It's like I'm alien in another planet, sort of like that.
Thank you, beautifully put. And all of these will be surfacing as we go along the way. Good. Well, on that basis, I will offer you the definition that Steiner and Wycoff came up with, but written by Steiner in this particular instance. I'm going to share screen. Oh no, that's no. Sorry, go back. We start here and do some preliminaries first. Right, there we are. Okay, can you all see that? So radical psychiatry, next along, developed by Claude Steiner, etc. I've told you that already. These are what they presented. They presented or written up by Steiner as their definition. So the conditions of oppression directly affect people's power to the extent that a person's potential for a harmonious life is not realized. We call his state of being alienation or powerlessness. So what they were talking about was the use of power in society and in families to dislocate people or alienate them from their own potential power, whether that's psychological, physical, social. So they're emphasizing the use of power in the degree to which people become alienated. We're looking at social power. For example, in South Africa, let's take that as an example because it's relevant to many of us. The conditions under apartheid, the conditions of oppression, disturbed people's ability to have a harmonious life based on race. So many people Black people were alienated from society in the wider sense. They couldn't vote, they had no power of agency. And if you opposed apartheid, you in turn became exiled, even if you were a white person. So they were alienated from, from the majority of the people and persuaded that there was something wrong with you. We'll come to that later. And that was so this is a social definition, but we'll come to more personal ones later. Now, when they developed this, they were very influenced by Marx and his definition of alienation, because the term alienation, certainly there were words like exile and other things before that, but it became prevalent in Marx's writing, which was in turn based on Hegel and Feuerbach. And the German term that Marx used is Entfremdung, which more literally means estrangement. Entfremdung. And so it's an estrangement of from others, or from oneself, or from part of oneself. So let's look at Marx's definition. And I will make these slides available, so not to worry about getting them down or having to photograph them. So he saw alienated labor in the capitalist system, where people had to sell their labor, and as a result were alienated from the means of production. So they couldn't produce their own stuff. They had to sell their labor so that stuff could be produced by them in a different context from what had happened before. And he reckoned that alienated labor alienates the worker first from the product of his labor, second from his own activity, third from what Marx, following Feuerbach, called species being, which I think is a wonderful phrase, and fourth, from other human beings. So all of you have mentioned ways in which you could be alienated from others, alienated from a sense of your species being, your humanity. And you haven't particularly mentioned labor and activity, but that was very much an economic, socio-economic aspect of it that Marx emphasized. Where am I going next? No, so any questions about that so far or comments?
So in
No? Sorry,
in organizations, some of the very where there are lots of employees and spread across different geographies, one form of alienation is also what we call as the hard posting. So somebody who offends authority is quickly transferred into some sort of a hard posting. So that's something that I was reminded of.
Yeah, that's a wonderful example of if you stand up against the power, what happens to you. And you might be motivated to stand up against the hierarchy or the power precisely because you already feel somewhat alienated from the structure, from the work, from the organizational culture. Is in some way you feel alienated from other people in the organization or even from your own nature by having to conform to what is going on there. And all the things that even Steiner, with all Hogie's influence, uses the word him. And sorry, I want to go back one. And Marx uses him all the time. So I want to give you a little her example. For instance, pre-capitalism, a woman might have had access to a local wool supply, even perhaps her own sheep grazing on the common land, her own spinning wheel, and the capacity to weave cloth with other local women. She would have worn and traded and sold her own products. This still happens to a large extent in parts of Africa and India, but of course ceased to happen a long time ago in Europe. And then single women were often particularly selected for work when the mills became, the weaving mills and spinning mills happened. A spinner might have been single women were often employed to be spinners because they were freer from family commitments, and they often would accept lower wages because they didn't have other people to support, and they were vulnerable in the society, so they could be bought cheaply. And from this comes our modern term spinster for a single woman. Some of them, I suspect, might have valued their independence as spinsters who didn't need to marry because they had their own small industry that they could use. But that's an example of how things changed within society and how people became cogs in the machine rather than human producers within their own right. And that is part of the alienation. So following on from that, I'm giving you background on which Steiner and others built their philosophy and process. Sartre, the existential philosopher, was also influential for them, but he tends to emphasize the result of it rather than the the economic and social causes of it. He refers to it as bad faith, that we refuse to accept the responsibility and the freedom of human existence. So authenticity is achieved, and so alienation overcome by not taking flight in the face of this existential anxiety or dread, but assuming responsibility for our choices. Now, this use of authenticity is not that different from what we would call authentic behavior in TA, being able to respond actively to one's own circumstances. That's the opposite of alienation for Sartre is authenticity. So returning now to Hogie Wycoff and George Steiner, I'm just going to skip past that and that. Oh, no, let's go. First of all, the other people that they were influenced by were Fromm and R.D. Laing. At the time, were making a very strong statement against the psychiatric establishment, who basically saw all disturbances that people were experiencing as their own problem, in a sense, either within their family or within their chemistry, but not as manifestations of social disorder. Fromm and R.D. Laing stepped into that to say a lot of what we deem to be individual social disorder may in fact be, in effect, a sane response to a crazy world. That there's much of how our world is organized that actually is not helpful to people, not healthy for people, and people have to find ways of dealing with that or coping with that. It's partly why Eric Berne invited us to take a Martian view of things, to step out of our earthly worldview that we are programmed into, to step out of it and look at it as if we were in fact aliens, which I find quite ironic, and see our world with new eyes, with fresh eyes, with unprogrammed eyes. So Fromm says, a sane society is one which helps the individual continually give birth to herself, whereas a society which is not sane stymies that ongoing rebirth and renders the individual in a state of alienation. So you are meant to be like this. This is what society expects of you. If you're feeling uncomfortable, it's your problem, not something that may not be responding to you within your social setting or within your family. And R.D. Laing is even, Fromm proposes a model of normative humanism, a redemptive notion that relieves some of our self-blame for feeling like we are going crazy by acknowledging that society itself, when bedeviled by certain pathologies, can be crazy-making for the individual. And R.D. Laing takes it even further, suggesting that the condition of alienation, of being asleep, of being unconscious, of being out of one's mind, is the condition of the normal man. Society highly values its normal man. It educates children to lose themselves and to become absurd, and thus to be normal. Normal men have killed perhaps 100 billion of their fellow normal men in the last 50 years. So his take on the craziness of much of our social conditioning and power structures and institutions was fairly extreme, fairly harsh. Any questions about any of this so far? I'm sort of rattling through the history to be able to get to the TA, the radical psychiatry group's use of it. But anything along the way that I need to explain more? Oh, we all okay? Right. So on the basis of the influence of these philosopher and psychologists and psychiatrists who were taking a radical view, the radical psychiatry group came up with this statement: extended individual psychotherapy is an elitist, outmoded as well as non-productive form of psychiatric help. It concentrates the talents of a few on a few. It silently colludes with the notion that people's difficulties have their sources within them, while implying that everything is well with the world. People's troubles have their source not within them, but in their alienated relationships, in their exploitation, in polluted environments, in war, and in the profit motive. And that these power plays and distortions within society, according to the radicals, was a major part of the psychological disturbance that people experienced. And I think this is a view that is becoming more prevalent in more recent times with, for instance, there's the group of psychiatrists in the United States who relatively recently organized a conference around what they saw as the Trump contagion. And they saw the Trump contagion as exhibiting power plays and behaviors that were in fact influencing and affecting large numbers of people in society. So in radical psychiatry, we see all psychic difficulties as forms of alienation. Now, I'd like to give you a little example. A little example of this in my recent work with someone. And then we can look at some of the TA concepts that will show up in relation to this. Someone that I was working with recently was talking about how, as a child, she'd been exiled from her beautiful island home and sent to England to boarding school, and felt completely alienated and distraught at that separation. It felt like an exile to her. And when she and later her sister and brother expressed extreme distress at being sent back when they visited home again, being sent back for the next term, it had no effect at all. So she was just told, no, this was for your own good. This is what has to happen for your own good. And then felt alienated from her own sense of herself, her own experience, which was, no, this is not good. This is terrible. And she, as a result now, she quite often feels like she's in a no man's land, in a limbo, and that she can't move forward. And she came up with this beautiful image, which I think says it all. She said, you know those stories about elephants that have been chained to a stake, and then the chain is removed and the elephant is free to walk away, but it doesn't. It stays there because it feels still chained. And that use of power over her from her father and other adults when she was a child, and boarding school itself, gave her this sense of alienation and disempowerment. And I think it's a very poignant, telling image of how in a situation in which someone is overpowered, whether socially or personally within the family, which also reflects the outer patriarchy, they can feel so alienated and disempowered. And yet she, for many years, of course, saw it as something wrong with herself. And so seeing it in the broader context of her disempowerment and alienation was helpful to her. Okay. So, further questions there, or any comments or questions so far? Oh, clear? Okay. Now, having arrived at their definition, which you had earlier, they identified that there were several ways of being alienated, several forms of this, from our minds, from our hearts, from our bodies or feelings, from our hands or work. So, oops, sorry, this is very sensitive, this thing. So, first of all, alienation from our hearts, and Claude Steiner, on the basis of this, developed the stroke economy. Are you all familiar with the term the stroke economy? Maybe new to you, Stefania. He said that the stroke economy modeled our existing capitalist economy, which was, it limited the exchange of strokes, in that strokes were treated as a scarce commodity that had to be traded rather than given freely. And you couldn't ask for strokes if you wanted them, and you couldn't allocate yourself strokes if you felt that you needed them. So it was like a scarce commodity that had to be held on to and only traded rather than given freely. Alienation from our minds would be the result of systematic lies and discounts. For example, in the example that I gave you earlier, that woman, when she was a child, her feelings were systematically discounted. Her longing to stay at home was systematically discounted. In social and wider fields, her father's role in the patriarchy and in their family was that only he made decisions, nobody else made decisions. And the wishes of children didn't count for very much. Even the wishes of a wife might not count for very much. So what he said was the law. And he knew how to make good decisions for everybody. We can be alienated from our bodies or feelings, taught to ignore bodily sensations and feelings. So over time, we may discount even the discomfort of our own bodies if we are taught to ignore them or to be afraid of them. Maybe taught to, no, you're not hungry, you're just tired. Or, no, you're not angry, you're just hungry, have something to eat. And so patterns of behavior may be set up that are just ignored and therefore become unhealthy. I'm often concerned about the state of people who work night shifts continually, because there is very great deal of evidence that it takes an enormous toll psychologically and physically. And yet people are expected to ignore it in the interests of wherever they're working. Alienation from our hands or work. So often work is reduced to meaningless work. The idea that work is a necessary evil is around for many, many people. And that takes an extraordinary toll if there's no meaning and joy in work. That's at a more socioeconomic level. And that's probably closest to Marx's original definition. Comments about this, please. I'm sure it's stoking some thoughts for you.
So I'm thinking, Di, the alienation from feelings, this is the whole racket feeling. So we alienated from our authentic felt feelings and we're told that's not okay. So we substitute for something else.
Yeah, thank you. Perfect example. We would develop a racket around whatever it was and the whole racket system. Yeah, as a way of trying to cope.
I feel like there's something missing in terms of like alienation from our, initially I wanted to say alienation from our own spirit, our own soul. But now the word going through my head is alienation from our humanity, which is interesting because they're kind of opposite ends there. But there's something missing there for me around, yeah, alienation from like that part inside that makes me me.
I think that's terribly important, and I completely agree with you. And in fact, Marx has it, and the radical psychiatry people don't, which surprises me, when he talks about species essence. It's our humanity, whether that's an inner sense of our humanity and our connection with other people, or whether it's a soul sense, a spiritual sense. Thank you. I think that it could be read in either way, but I think it's missing. I agree with you completely. Anything else?
I was just thinking when you mentioned the Trump contagion, that I think that is actually as a result of alienation, and that people have come together and feel that they belong, who come together in their, feelings about Trump. But and I think that if you think about the way politicians have always been portrayed in the States, but actually I think everywhere, that politicians are supposed to be very well educated. They speak in a certain way. They're supposed to have no skeletons in the closet. If they do, they've got to find a way to get rid of it and hide it, so they come out looking so squeaky clean. We're alienated from that. This isn't who I am. Trump comes out and he goes, I'm just like everybody, and he splatters all of that stuff that makes people feel, I belong there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct. And I think he's drawing heavily on people's alienation from so much around them and their sense of powerlessness. And he's offering, I'll be your all-powerful person for you and be just like you. Yeah. I think and of course he's not just like them at all. He's a flipping billion, but or at least claims to be, but maybe.
So bizarre.
But yes, that alienation. Any other comments there?
I just have a question, just in my ignorance. Is Stockholm syndrome a form of alienation?
It would be. I would agree with you. It becomes an alienation from one's own actual reality, where you begin to see the persecutor in your life as somebody that you could identify with and be close to. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would say it would be a form of alienation. The other thing that occurs to me is that there's also possibly could be alienation from some aspect of ourselves, which is slightly different from heart or mind. It may be, for instance, sexual orientation, where you're taught that you shouldn't have or shouldn't be have that particular sexual orientation, or even identity, and that that aspect of yourself, that sense of yourself, or some important part of yourself is not allowed, and you are alienated from that, either by society at large or by your family in particular. Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking of that. I think when you read the quote from Fromm about where we should be, well, to not be alienated, a sane society where we would help individuals to give birth to themselves, the true self. And it made me think of how there is this huge movement towards I am, and if I am different, I'm still okay. And you know, in terms of gender identity and sexual identity, identifying and being allowed to identify as sexually different,
Yeah.
and being okay. But it's also interesting how there's such a strong backlash and pushback by certain areas of society. And I was thinking about the other day that you know, if you looked at it in terms of percentage wise, people who are transgender and everything else, and you know, who maybe identify that as extremely different, they might say pansexual, or I'm asexual, accept me as I am. They are seen as a threat, and yet, you know, why? What is it about that creates such an uproar that you are not the same as us, therefore? You know, what is the insecurity around that?
Well, I suspect that part of the insecurity around that is the level of alienation that we ourselves experiencing. So,
Yeah.
if we are ourselves experiencing ourselves as alienated from our hearts or our minds or our own bodies or feelings, it's much more important to be able to point to somebody else who's bad and we're good, we're fine.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they're the problem. Rather than have to deal with the problems of either the power structures or the beliefs or the patterns or attitudes that are alienating us from ourselves.
Yeah. And I think that when we can other people, when we can point fingers and cast out, that gives us a sense of belonging. That's sometimes for us how we belong, is by recognizing we are this and you are other.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. That gives some, at least,
Sense of power.
of belonging and of being associated with those who hold power, if not having power directly yourself. Yeah. And, you know, it always mystifies me how many women can support the patriarchy again and again, whether it's in the USA or by rallying around Zuma when he's on a rape charge.
Amazing.
It is quite extraordinary and speaks to the extent to which our minds have become controlled, which we believing systematic lies and discounts. Steve Biko, I think, is so important here. His quote, "The most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed." That speaks to your Stockholm syndrome and why so many Black people would accept or support or not fight against apartheid, and why so many women can still support the patriarchy in one form or another. Either that or through sheer fear. I was so amazed to hear for the first time some figures in the US election of how many women for the first time were saying they were going to vote against what their husband was secretly going to vote against what their husband said they should do. Now, in this day and age?
Yeah, incredible.
In the USA?
Yeah, sure. I see Priya's hand is up, Di.
Oh, sorry, Priya, I didn't
I
see.
don't see it.
Yeah, so I was along the same line. Something that came to me was also the extreme sense of alienation from life itself, not seeing purpose and meaning to go on with life, you know, so very heightened form of alienation I felt.
Yes, I guess one could see it in that way, as a sense of there is no meaning, there is no purpose, there is, why should I be alive? Mm. Mm. Thank you. So carrying on from here.
Stefania, your hand is up.
Oh, Stefania, sorry.
Just I was something pops up in my head right now. I'm listening to all these examples, and it started from these various sexual orientations that, well, the names of it really that came up, and people being resistant to that. If I may share just briefly an example of the same, because I have a question after that. So I have a teacher friend who was resistant to one of her pupils' names. So his first name, his parents being working in, I'm Romanian. Sorry, I didn't tell anybody. I'm Romanian. A lot of Romanians go and work outside in Italy, mostly Italy and Spain. The parents of this child had him in Italy, and they gave him an Italian name. And they came back home, and he was enrolled in school in my friend's class. And having this Italian name, she had a very organic and very aggressive reaction to that. And she bluntly refused to use that name, saying out loud that it's not a Romanian name, so I'll call you this. And she Romanized the name. And that came in my head exactly when we said, when we were wondering, why are people so resistant to people defining themselves as whatever they are? I am a dolphin. How does that bother you if I just say that? So this is a note to self to explore that, but I'm wondering, what is the root of this resistance of people defining themselves as they are? Yeah, why are people, why is that bad in the view of some people? This is my question right now.
In response to your particular example, I don't know that for that particular person, but in broader sense, I think what I think Marguerite earlier said, that we, by making ourselves into a unit and excluding those who are different, we can feel more secure about ourselves and forget about the level to which we are ourselves alienated in terms of powerlessness or not being accepted for all sorts of reasons within our own society. Maybe poor, maybe the wrong class, maybe not educated, any number of reasons that we may feel alienated ourselves.
Thank you.
Okay, so on the strength of this, and because we're TA practitioners and we love formulas, they came up with this formula, which changed over the years in various ways, but this is the one that I'm going to stick with, which is alienation consists of oppression plus mystification plus isolation, resulting in a sense of powerlessness. So in a situation of oppression, in which people are then also mystified about the oppression and kept isolated from each other in the sense of not being encouraged to form collectives. The nuclear family is very isolating. So this is the formula that they came up with. So if we look at the oppression, this is any abuse of power systematic or individual, to diminish people. Most dispossessed are most attacked, power plays and competition. And they this is how the oppression shows up, either socially or, as I say, within the family, or within a particular caste or class. And the kind of power plays would be, for instance, their various TA concepts that come to mind here, one being the drama triangle. The next part is mystification, which justifies the oppression or privileges gained. Discounting and gaslighting, fake news and propaganda. So in the case of South Africa, the oppression of Black people in South Africa was very strongly justified in terms of even, white people are naturally superior, more educated, more intelligent, and even for some of the Christian nationalists, God made white people to rule over Black people. So it's a God-given gift, which helps to justify the oppression and keep people mystified as to the real nature of the oppression, which is the exploitation of power, the exploitation of people, and often resources as well. And there's all the fake news and propaganda that goes with that. Isolation. Our culture and our society, by and large, encourages competition over cooperation, individualism, and the nuclear family, all of which combine to keep people more isolated rather than more in contact with each other. I've given you a few examples, but I'm sure you have examples from your own experience, so please share them if you're thinking of something. Anybody? I'm thinking of your early example, Priya, of being cast out from a family if you married in the wrong caste, being thrown out, being disowned, and isolated as a result, and not being able to deal with that. And the mystification being what you're doing is terribly damaging to your whole family, which is, how? But that would be what would be said. Okay, so if that's the formula for damage, what is the formula for recovery? Because this is just as important, more important even. So, alienation. So, their phrase that they come up is power for people, individuals, comes out of contact, awareness, and action. Having seen some other definitions, like from insane society, I'm wondering whether power should perhaps read authenticity there rather than power. Authenticity or wholeness, where one's not alienated, comes through contact, awareness, and action. Contact means cooperation, honest communication, no drama triangle roles. So again, authentic communication. Awareness, learning to see through the lies, misinformation, and discounts. And action, joining with others to effect the change we want. Would you mind, Stefania, if I use the example of your team during COVID?
No, not at all. No.
Stefania was sharing with me recently how well her team on board ship had worked during COVID, largely because the authority figures had collapsed under the strain and the structures no longer worked because everything had to change. And her team were at last able to make good contact with each other and other people. They were able to bypass the silly rules and regulations that they normally had to abide by for no particular reason. And they cooperated with others across the board to be as effective as they needed to and wanted to be. So they moved from being a relatively alienated team bound by hierarchies and regulations that they didn't identify with, to being self-empowered individuals who could work together and be very effective. Is that a fair summary, Stefania?
Yes, thank you. The feeling, you missed the feeling of relief.
I
Of
missed the feeling of relief. Yeah.
the feeling of relief of not having to obey what we thought was, we lost the rules. We should have been scared, but it was actually relief. We lost the rules and regulating authority, but it was a relief in the end.
Thank you.
It brings to mind, I watched a documentary on the early days of communism in Russia, and they took everything to its absolute extreme. So even the choirs and the orchestras had no conductors, no leader. They were leaderless orchestras, leaderless choirs. And these people who were interviewed were saying how magnificent it was to be able to watch each other and work together, not all watching one leader, but to be so in tune with each other for music that, that you have to bring together. It was so beautiful, and the sadness with which they spoke of how this all then became corrupted and couldn't and didn't last.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So whether that word at the top there changes from power to authenticity, or maybe to liberation, or I don't know, but it seems to me that it's more in that vein. But it does result in a sense of empowerment. Yeah. And relief. And creativity.
But it also seems to me, Di, that in action lies the problem. In the word action, not the word, but that part of this is that the moment we join with others to effect the change we want, the wheels seem to come off, and alienation then starts to creep in, and mess everything up. And I suppose that is why the conclusion that sort of isolation and the nuclear family is the way to go, because the less people you have to negotiate with, the better to get what we want, you know?
Yeah, our whole society does not school us well
Mm,
in cooperative learning, cooperative
yeah,
action. I think that's part of the problem.
yeah, that makes sense to me.
It's not something we're schooled in, and it also it's an ongoing issue to deal with each of our levels of we have transgenerational levels of alienation here and trauma that goes with that. So when we come together, this is not a simple formula. It is at one,
Yeah,
and of course at another level, it's constant process of breaking contact, making it again, losing awareness, finding it again, stopping action, creating it again, agreeing on action again. So this is, I think, it should be written like a learning cycle.
yeah, that makes sense, and it does. Yeah, it's not a sort of conclusive thing.
No.
It is something that will break, and the connections will break and reconnect over and
Yeah,
over again. Yeah,
that's how I'm seeing it, that this is
yeah, absolutely.
ongoing work. Like we thought in the 60s and 70s that we'd changed the world. Well, we
Yeah.
had never been the same since in certain regards, and
Mm.
sorts of things are just exactly the same.
I'm wondering, looking at those words, to affect the change we want, is that something around the challenge? And I wonder if it's different in a collectivist versus an more individualistic community or society. You know, the individualists are told to be your own person, and almost as like everyone's pulling in different directions. There's not, if we go back to the basic contracting, you know, it's an agreed bilateral or multilateral contract. And maybe so much of the work, if we go back 2 steps to contact, is in what do we really want? You know, we of the same mind here. I'm thinking of I'm speaking from one of my friends who's a Quaker. You know, we speak with the mind of the meeting. Almost what's that one mind? I'm probably not using the right terminology, but that essence of what is our one mind here is where real work happens.
Yeah, and it takes time to come to that place. It's not a quick process within the Quakers to come to that place. And sometimes we do it well, and sometimes we just avoid the conflict. In my opinion. So in the urgency to reach one mind, we can sometimes avoid some of the conflict that's actually still lingering. So it's a process. My husband's been very involved for the past year in conflict in our local community around the baboons. And that's been a fascinating process of running facilitated workshops in which people could hopefully hear each other better, make real contact despite their differences of opinions, become more aware of all the expert information that is known about the baboons as opposed to the rumors, and then seeing whether we could join in action. But in effect, that only went part of the way. A lot of people simply could not or would not come on board because they had agendas of their own and fears of their own that were and beliefs that were different to each other, different from each other. Like some people had a view that no single baboon must ever be harmed or even frightened. And that was an immovable barrier for them to any possibility of working on a cooperative process of action and change. So, yeah. But it was an interesting process. And people, I think, did feel very much more empowered as a result of it, because a lot of people had ceased to be involved at all in the debate and just stepped back, and the social media had taken over and was quite toxic. But in this process, at least people did feel more empowered to communicate with the authorities and so on and so forth. So, okay, so these are the challenges.
So Di,
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt you. Could remind me, this formula was developed by whom?
By Hogie Wycoff and Claude Steiner particularly. And he wrote it up mostly, but definitely credited her with being very influential. She had been very active in the women's movement, which at that time was very much looking at things like cooperatives and misinformation, mystification, and all of those kind of things around the patriarchy. So, but he wrote it up. I've got a list of references for you at the end. No, there was one I wanted to go back up to here. Yes, looking at, we looked at the drama triangle in terms of power plays and competition and then mystification, and things like script obviously come to mind, and also cultural scripting. In terms of TA theory, oppression, Claude Steiner developed the term pig parent, which I think we don't really use in TA anymore. But in its day, it was quite a significant term, and I think also related to the Vietnam War demonstrations where police were referred to as pigs. And so the pig parent was a particular nasty policing little aspect of the parent in the child that would keep people mystified and oppressed. Any other TA theory things that come to mind for any of you in any of this?
I'm thinking of the sense of okayness. I'm okay, you're okay, we're okay, they're okay. And
Yes.
particularly Schotten's turning it from a square into that triangle and putting on the hegemony axis of the privileged and the underclass. Those are the words he uses.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm okay, you're okay keeps power over the I'm not okay, you're okay. It's a lovely visual.
Yeah.
To
it's a very good way of representing power relations. I agree. Okay, so let's carry on, because I want to look at the more modern uses of TA, in TA, of alienation and the concept. So one of the first people to take up the radical psychiatry group again afresh and give it new life was Keith Tudor. And his use of the word alienation is shown here. He developed the idea that there was a fifth driver. And that fifth driver, are you familiar with the drivers, Stefania?
Yes.
Yes,
A little
good.
bit.
A little bit. You know him. So he developed the fifth driver, take it, as a relational dynamic that expresses and confirms an individual's alienation from his or her productive capacity, other people, society, and the earth. So in terms of being alienated from our existence in many ways, take it is like, I'm out there and I can just grab it and take it. And he saw this as an intrinsic part, or sees this as an intrinsic part of our capitalist socio-political system, neoliberal socio-political system, where competition is key. If you don't take it, somebody else will. If you don't grab, somebody else will. And this fulfills it deals with, as all drivers sort of compensate for various injunctions, this would compensate for the injunction of many injunctions: don't be important, don't have needs, and this would be don't be close to others, compete and take it. And I'm just going to give you a little bit more of Keith Tudor. He says that it's a useful way, I don't know how much more I put in here. Yes, it's a useful way in which to frame psychopathology, because it contextualizes pathology as alienation from relationship. Alienation generally leads to individualism and a competitive frame of reference. And in this competitive frame of reference, take it becomes an important driver. Any thoughts about that or comments?
Well, I just was thinking and remembering how take it was so apparent during COVID and how people rushed to the shops and fought over toilet paper, you know. And I also remember the days when Cape Town was that close to what was the day, ground zero or whatever we called it, when we had no water left and people were stockpiling water, you know. Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, we did also have, at the same time as those many people were running a take it driver, we had other people moving into the contact, awareness, cooperation phase.
Yes, in such a big way as well. Yeah.
So both aspects of human response was available for observation during those times. Yeah, I agree with you. Yes, Ania.
I have a question right now. So in this context, in this very, very context that we just mentioned right now, then is fighting for survival or survival instinct a form of alienation?
No, I don't think that's the same. I think the issue of survival is much more true to our human species nature. If we're struggling for survival, we will literally do what we need to do to survive, but we will also often cooperate, because that is often the best way of surviving. I mean, you know, if you're really going to survive, the best is to have other people around you and to work together to survive and to share what little you have as long as you can, and develop more if you can. Whereas this is much more about, I'm going to survive no matter at who else's expense. And it might not even be about survival. It might be about imagined threat. Like,
Yeah, I
you
was
know,
going
what
to
happens
ask,
if
so
you run out of toilet paper, for God's sake?
yeah.
You know, nothing very much.
So it's then it's more of a genuine act or positioning for survival, and an artificial one, or an imagined one, or an exaggerated one. I
Yes,
see. Thank you
that's
very
how
much.
I understand it. And where the more alienated we are from our true needs and self, the more likely we are to respond to imagined needs and threats and be alienated from a position of alienation. That makes sense?
Yes, yes, very much. Thank you.
I seem to have a memory that when Tudor was talking about his take-it driver, he also commented somewhere about the positive side of it, as in like, it's okay, just go for it, you can do it. And I'm
Yes.
wondering, no, he didn't speak particularly about working styles as Hay did, but yeah, what's your memory of that, or your thinking
Yeah,
about that?
I should have mentioned, because he does spend quite a lot of time looking at that all drivers have some positive aspect. And this does have, as far as I recall, I don't know if I put anything down here. He sees it as you say, yes, it's okay to go for something. It's okay to express your outreach for something and somebody, some situation, but from a position of from the okay position, rather than from I'm only okay as long as I take things, which is what is always the negative aspect of the driver, is the conditional okayness.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm only okay as long as I'm consuming, say,
Thank you.
or taking from other people. Keith also does, and I haven't got it here, but he also does look at how the take it driver might combine with other drivers, as other people have looked at various drivers in combination. He looks at the take it driver in combination with various others, but I'm not going to go into that now. I just recommend you the reading of the article. Okay, so the next bit, no, something's not happening here. There we go. Sandy Hoffman, who is not a TA person, but she's a local South African psychologist that I persuaded one year to write an article for the TAJ. And she raises the important point, I think, in TA terms, which is that alienation is experienced when recognition is withheld or negation occurs. And I think that's a very good way of putting it. She worked in Pollsmoor with particular group of prisoners and wrote her thesis about her work with them. And in transactional analysis terms, it's the experience of I'm not okay. I think has to be part of the alienation, the experience of alienation is somehow I'm not okay. And chances are they're okay, may also be they're also not okay. She doesn't say that, but I think we can take that as read. Alienation, as I intended, is reflected in the Marxist concept cited in Hook as a loss of reality to the situation where human beings are estranged from their own bodies, from the natural world, and from their potentially universal essences. That brings in, I think that the point that you raised, who raised it? Somebody raised that point about being estranged from our universal essences.
That was me. And I'm just smiling. I didn't know Sandy Hoffman wrote something for the THA. She was my first ever psychologist I ever went to go see. How funny is that?
Yeah, she's an excellent psychologist.
She's lovely. Yeah, what a small world.
A friend of mine, and one year I managed to persuade her to put some of her stuff into the TAJ.
That was my pre-TA days. Who knew?
You're getting a lot of history today. Yeah, so Hooke takes in that universal essences, which is how he presumably, or she, I don't know, is understanding species essence from Marx. And somebody earlier mentioned the, oh yeah, Karen, you were talking about the I'm okay, you're okay, they're okay, etc. Here is the alienation as I'm not okay, or we're not okay, maybe a whole group that experience themselves as not okay. I'm always interested in the South African situation where we had relative experiences of not okayness. Like the coloreds could be not okay in relation to the whites, but I'm okay, you're not okay in relation to Black people, African people. So it all depended where you were on the hierarchy as to who you could be above or who you could be okay in relation to, but it was always conditional on somebody else being not okay. Okay, the next one is Karen Minikin, who also has used the concept of alienation to good effect in her writings recently in the TAJ. And she understands it as the idea of alienation within a framework of social, macro, and psychic, micro relational dynamics. And I move between political, social, cultural, and personal frames of reference, suggesting that an alienated frame of mind includes experiences of psychic and cultural death. So I may feel that some aspect of myself or my culture has been annihilated in an experience of alienation. Anybody got an example of that? I'm thinking that this is particularly true at an individual psychic level, but I'm thinking that's the individual psychic, but I'm thinking of people in Gaza at the moment who are not only experiencing physical death, but also something of a cultural death of what is happening to them is an annihilation of their whole culture. And yeah, within the world frame, that they're simply not valued as people or nor as a culture, and they're having to deal with that as well as actual death. So the experience of power over can be both physically and psychologically and culturally experienced as a death. And then last but by no means least, Giles Barrow from the educational field, who
Di?
yes, Sure.
Sorry to interrupt. Stefania has her hand up.
Oh, sorry, Stefania.
I was just going to mention this situation of the First Nations in Canada, Aboriginals in Australia. So it happened then, but these are still active right now. The way they were forcibly assimilated, and I have friends in Australia who are all the time mentioning this thing, and from both sides I've heard it and seen it. So that is, I think, an example of cultural.
Thank you. I agree with you. And I was thinking of our first people, the Khoisan, who had similar experiences. Yeah, that is very, very much a clear illustration of that. So Giles brings it into the educational realm and touches to some extent on what Karen was talking about in terms of how do we see these things like growth, autonomy, and freedom. He wants to revisit those in the context of alienation, because he looks at growth, for instance, in our world. We have growth economies and yet a planet that cannot grow any further. When does growth become unhealthy? When does autonomy come at the expense of homonymy and cooperation and contact with other people? When is autonomy about just going for ourselves and not taking into account other people? And when is freedom, our freedom at the expense of others, or freedom from or freedom to? And revisiting these in the context of an alienation which is affecting all of us within our current context to some degree or other. He suggests sufficiency, homonymy, and emancipation are three tentative reframing ideas that arise when education is considered in terms of the encountered experience. And by encountered experience, he means a non-alienating experience. He doesn't actually use the term alienation, I don't think, in his article, but it is in fact addressing problems of alienation, where, for instance, he talks about, oh, sorry, I've gone backwards. The whole title of his article is Antidote to Neoliberal Exploitation of the Educational Task. So where education has become not a contactful process, but an alienated experience of exploiting teachers, exploiting children, power over instead of power alongside, and those kind of things. And she sees as an alienating experience. Is Karen still with us? Karen, are you still there? No.
I am.
Oh, you are, because I thought you'd be pleased to see this come up from.
Oh, absolutely. This is so much of, I think,
what you were saying.
Pete Shotton and Giles and many of the educational people are going, education has just been oppression, basically, and alienation is so part of that.
Good. So that we've covered all the bases in terms of psychotherapy and organizations and education. And Priya, do you want to say anything more from an organizational point of view?
The first thing that came to mind is the sense of empowerment that the workforce feels when they're constantly being sensitized, taken through awareness sessions. It's a part of the educative frame. How the sense of knowing brings them into that space of, sort of like an expansiveness, both of the mind and the relationship. So where they would have felt alienated, I think it's about saying, getting into a sense of agency to say that I have it in me to know how I can belong. I have it in me to know how I can draw boundaries. So that's the first thing that came to me, that it's a very, conscious and mindful intervention adopted by organizations to educate employees. So all the things that fall in the diversity and inclusion spectrum. So all of that, where technically the sensitivities would be to feel alienated, to say, this is how you can belong, or you can make yourself included.
And you've experienced some cases where that has been working within organizations. Yeah. I asked you not because you're an organizational person, but because I know you've worked in quite a lot of organizations. And Marguerite, anything from your side?
What I think, as Priya was speaking, something I thought of I went to a seminar given by Peter Block. He's an organizational consultant. And something he said that always made me laugh was how organizations, leaders want to run workshops or processes within organizations to make sure that we're all in the same boat. And Peter Block always says, well, how do you know what boat you're in? Or how do you know you're even in a boat? So he shakes all of that up, and the groupthink and the conform so that we can make more money type of thinking. Yeah, so that was just going around in my head, but I haven't really placed it in this very well at the moment.
I'm thinking that the underlying motive here is so important, isn't it? Is the underlying motive really to make profit, or is the underlying motive to build a good culture where people thrive and hopefully can make some money as well? So
yes.
I think that this is always going to be the issue of where the power lies, who really has the power, and for what purposes. Because I've been certainly in some situations with organizations where it was clear that people were being brought in to make sure that the workforce didn't rock the boat.
Exactly.
Whichever boat they happen to be in. Karen.
I think this for me is, there's such a beautiful connection with appreciative inquiry now, where a whole system's voice comes together, from the most junior person in the system who maybe mops a floor to the most senior member, and they gather in connection around the conversation of what brings us most alive in the system. And they share stories and then extract principles. For me, that, and linking to what you said, Marguerite, about Peter Block. Sorry, I'm confusing another Peter I know. That gets everyone in the same boat, or whatever it is, because it's that deep core. For me, it's also what you name and what you stroke is going to develop. So in communication, not on an informal Google questionnaire, it's in that personal relationship. Let's talk about this, what brings us most alive.
Yeah. So what you're saying sounds lovely and takes me mentally straight back to our contact, awareness, and action formula.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And action, I think action without the contact or awareness is pointless action. I know
Yeah.
in some of my other journeying, part of an organization that talks about contemplation and action, and say that action without contemplation is probably going to alienate. They don't use that term, but it's quite aggressive, where contemplation and being more within our essence without action is also pointless. It's got to be a beautiful balance between both.
Good. Well, thank you all. I've got one slide of references that I will make available to everybody. There they are. And that's the end of my presentation. So I would love to hear some closing words from all of you about what you found interesting or useful or challenging.
I've thought about all of it in so many different contexts as we've gone along, but I think the last one in particular, the context I'm thinking of is the school system, and particularly around children who are neurodivergent and how they've always been alienated as like the naughty kid because they can't sit still at a desk, you know, for 6 hours a day, even though their brains actually physically can't accommodate that.
Yeah, most children probably can't.
Yeah, well, true.
Most
But
children
can't.
can't.
Exactly.
Some children learn to tune out
Good
of their,
timing, Evie.
tune out of their body and out of their heart and mind and adapt to it.
Exactly. And I'm just thinking like that contact and awareness and action, like the educators are so misinformed or non-informed around that. You know, and my sister's a teacher, and she said out of 26 children in her class, 21 of them need some kind of special accommodation, and she's not trained in any of that. She's just doing it off her own research and her own common sense because she cares. But not everybody has that resourcefulness or care or whatever it is. And you know, the children suffer because of it and get alienated. And how does that then carry on through their lives?
And those who don't manage to adjust get into trouble, and those who do manage to adjust store up trouble for later, for their psychotherapy years.
And I was thinking about some of the earlier thinking around alienation, where they said it's like this is actually like a normal response to an insane situation or whatever the words were. And I think that is so relevant to that, where it's like, come on, round pegs fit into our square holes or whatever it is, you know.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Any other reflections or comments? What's your takeaway?
I really enjoyed the kind of unpacking of what some of the terms are, because I can be a little bit overwhelmed when I'm just reading articles and like, what actually does this mean? So you really brought it alive. And I think the part that really impacts me is a reminder or confirmation that the social aspect, it's that crazy world, is so key. And I know we're having some conversations around in the TA journey about context and making that explicit. And so this is really just reinforcing a conversation I had yesterday in another committee. So thank you for that.
Great.
May I?
Yes, Stefania?
Well, as you know, this concept came up for me in my own personal story. So today's session serves only to make me understand it better and to give me the tools to understand that, recognize that, and deal with that. personally. And as we were speaking right now, and thank you ladies for all your examples, I'm trying to, I'm actually not trying, I'm recognizing more of that in my own stories and world and everything. I had a few, oh, that's what it was about X and Y, and a few of those. So it serves me personally very, very strongly and very deeply. So thank you very much for that.
Good, glad you could join us.
For me, I think it was like so enriching to see different concepts from different worlds coming together. Sort of like the word that stayed is the encountered experience. So how it meets the TA world. I loved I'm feeling quite stimulated. I think there are lots of light bulbs that are glowing at the moment. So, but a couple of things that I was reminded of. One was the story of the ugly duckling, and the realization that I don't have to struggle to belong in a place where I don't, but here's where I do. And for me, that's a journey of agency, like coming into a sense of autonomy, authenticity, as you spoke about it. The other is, this is something that you may not be aware of. There's a wonderful Hindi movie called Mirch Masala, which was a very late 1980s movie, which was an award-winning movie. It's about oppression in a village where women are, there is the village head who, if his eyes fall on a certain woman, she is expected to submit sexually to his needs. And the whole story is about one woman standing up and saying, hey, I have the autonomy to choose my agency of saying, do I want to or not? And there's an entire group of women who work in Mirch Masala is basically chili powder. It's a factory which manufactures chili powder. So she takes refuge in that factory, and the movie ends with how the entire women and the man who heads the factory come together and use the spice symbolically to redeem her from the oppression, which is like literally the redemption that the entire village get from oppression. So that's what I was reminded of when, in the way the session came to a conclusion, that it's all about that sense of redemption, of claiming their sense of self.
And liberation, I'm also thinking. That word liberation is coming up for me again. Yeah. Thank you. Wonderful. Anybody else? Marguerite, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if anyone else wants to say anything before I do, but it doesn't look like it. So yeah, thank you so much, Di. It was fascinating. Priya, like you, I had sort of, my mind was popping like popcorn as each slide came up. It was like, ooh, and that relates to that, and that relates to that. So this has been a lot of fun. Thanks very much, Di.
Good. Glad you enjoyed it. And thank you all for being part of it. And I enjoyed your ideas coming to me and questions shaking up things here and there. And I still want to hear from all of you. You can email me directly about what that word should be at the beginning of the formula instead of power. I just don't think power is right. So give me your thoughts. And I think this is something that needs to be taken further.
So maybe I add my word as the chair of the SATAA. Thank you everybody for joining us in this webinar. And thank you, Di. You really are one of our TA ancestors, and you hold such wisdom, experience. There's that activism, there's that social compassion, your keen thinking, and you've just really given us such a gift today being with you. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much for that.
The founders of the SATAA as well. We honor you for that. It was your vision all those years ago that has brought us to being.
Thank you so much for that. Okay. Good. We're done, I think. Does anybody need to talk to me afterwards about anything, Marguerite, or we done?
I think we're done. Yeah, if you can stay on, we
Okay,
can have a little chat.
right.
Good.
Okay.
All right.
Bye, everybody.
Bye,
Thank
everybody.
you. Thank